In the fall of 1910, on a proving ground in Springfield, Massachusetts, a single pistol was fired 6,000 times in 2 days. When it grew too hot to hold, they dipped it in water and kept firing. At the end, it had jammed not once. 0 malfunctions, 6,000 rounds. The Army officers who watched it had never seen anything like it, and one of them wrote that the pistol was the most reliable sidearm ever submitted to the United States government. That pistol was the Colt 45. The man who designed it stood in the room and watched it happen, and for the next 74 years, it would ride on the hip of nearly every American soldier who went to war. 2 world wars, Korea, Vietnam. It was the gun a father carried and the gun a son inherited, and the gun that came home in a footlocker to sit in a drawer for 50 years, still working, still loaded, still ready. 75 years after that test in Springfield, the United States Army walked away from it. Not because it failed, not because something better came along that anyone could clearly prove. The Army handed its sidearm contract to a company from a valley in northern Italy, a family firm older than the United States itself, and the American company that had armed the nation since 1847, the company whose name was stamped into the story of the West, began to come apart. Today, the rampant Colt, that little rearing horse that has marked these guns for more than a century and a half, still says Hartford, Connecticut on the slide. But the company behind it is owned in Prague. This spring, the American icon that built the pistol that won 2 world wars was listed on a stock exchange in Amsterdam. How a gun this good, this loved, this deeply American, ended up as a line item on a European exchange is a story about far more than one lost contract. It is a story about who was quietly taking the company apart from the inside, while the whole country was looking at the gun. To understand how a company this deeply American ended up owned in Prague, you have to start with a young man who failed. Failed badly, and more than once, before any of the rest of it was possible. Samuel Colt was born in Hartford, Connecticut in 1814. His mother died when he was a boy. His father sent him off to work in a factory and then to sea, and it was on that voyage, as the story goes, that a teenage Colt watched the wheel of the ship turn and lock, and imagined a pistol whose cylinder could do the same. He was granted a patent for that idea in 1836, and he built his first factory in Paterson, New Jersey, to make it real. It went bankrupt. The guns were clever, but the market was not ready and the money ran out, and by 1842, the Paterson factory closed its doors and Samuel Colt was broke. Personally, humiliatingly broke in his 20s, with a brilliant invention and nothing to show for it. If the story had ended there, no one would remember his name. What saved him was a war and a Texas Ranger. During the war with Mexico, a captain named Samuel Walker, who had used Colt's early revolvers on the frontier and swore by them, came looking for the inventor and asked him to build a bigger, more powerful version. The Army ordered 1,000 of them. Colt had no factory anymore, so he contracted the work out to a man named Eli Whitney in Connecticut and delivered. That order put him back on his feet, and with the money from it, in 1855, Samuel Colt built the thing that would make him immortal. If you are watching this on your phone right now, do one small thing before we go on. Tap the hype button on your screen. It costs you nothing, and it tells the algorithm that stories about the things America used to build deserve to be seen. Now, back to Hartford. On a low stretch of land along the Connecticut River in Hartford, he raised an armory unlike anything the world had seen. It was, at the time, the largest private arms factory on Earth. Walk into it in its prime, and the first thing that hit you was the noise. The concussion of drop hammers shaping hot steel, felt in the chest before it was heard by the ear. The air was thick with the smell of machine oil and coal smoke and scorched metal. Rows of belt-driven machines ran the length of the floor, turning out parts so consistent that they were interchangeable. A genuinely new idea in manufacturing, and one that Colt helped pioneer. At its height, the armory could turn out 150 finished weapons every single day. Colt crowned the main building with a blue onion dome studded with gold stars and topped it with a rampant colt, a rearing horse that became the mark stamped on every gun the company made. You could see that dome from across the river, and the men who worked beneath it wore the fact like a badge. To say you worked at Colt in Hartford in those years was to say you were among the best in the country at making the finest machines a human hand could make. It said, without a word, that something important was made here by people who knew exactly how good they were. Samuel Colt became one of the richest men in America, and then, at the height of it, he died. Rheumatic fever took him in January of 1862 at the age of 47. He never saw the Civil War end, the war that made his company a fortune arming the Union. He left the company to his wife, Elizabeth Jarvis Colt, who ran it with a steady hand through the rest of the century, rebuilding the armory stone by stone after a devastating fire, keeping the family name on the guns and the guns in the hands of a growing nation. But here, right at the beginning, in the years of the company's greatest strength, a quiet thread was already being spun, and it runs straight through everything that comes later. The company's fortune was built on selling to the government. War made Colt rich, and peace made Colt nervous. When the wars ended, the orders dried up, and the company laid men off and searched for the next buyer in a uniform. Colt was never really its own master. It was married to the customer with the biggest checkbook in the world, the United States military. And a marriage like that gives one side enormous power over the other. There was one more thread, and it is a strange and painful one, because it involves the very man who would give Colt its greatest gun. His name was John Browning, and he was the most gifted firearms designer who ever lived. Browning designed for Colt, but he did not only design for Colt. When he tried to change the way he was paid, asking for a running royalty on every gun sold, rather than a single flat fee, the American companies balked. So Browning took some of his finest work across the ocean to a Belgian firm called Fabrique Nationale in a town called Herstal. He helped turn that Belgian company into a world power in firearms. He would die there, in that Belgian factory, in 1926, having made Fabrique Nationale into one of the great arms makers of the world. A Belgian company, built up in part by the same American genius who gave Colt its legendary .45. Decades from now, that Belgian company would come back into Colt's story, and when it did, it would not come as a friend. To understand why the army wanted that pistol so badly, you have to go back to a jungle war most Americans have forgotten, and to the sound of a revolver that would not do its job. At the turn of the century, American soldiers were fighting in the southern islands of the Philippines against warriors called the Moro. The standard sidearm was a Colt revolver chambered for a small round, the .38 long Colt. On paper, it was fine. In the jungle, it was a death sentence. The Moro fighters would bind their own bodies tightly with cord and vegetation before a charge to slow the bleeding, and they used local drugs to blunt the pain, and they worked themselves into a religious fury before they came out of the grass with long knives. American officers wrote the same terrible report over and over. A Moro warrior would take 5 or 6 bullets in the chest and keep coming. And the after-action reports described a scene that repeated itself until it became a kind of nightmare. 2 bodies lying close together in the mud, a Moro with 6 holes in him, and a young American soldier next to him, cut down, still gripping an empty revolver that had failed to stop the man in time. Word of this reached Washington. In 1904, the Army ran a set of tests in Chicago, led by an ordnance officer named John Thompson, who would later invent the submachine gun that carried his name, and a military surgeon named Louis Lagarde. The tests were grim. They fired different calibers into cattle and into human cadavers to measure what actually stopped a body in motion. The conclusion was blunt. No round smaller than 45/100ths of an inch across belonged in a military handgun. The Army wanted a .45, and it wanted one that would never, ever jam. That is what John Browning built. And in the fall of 1910, on that proving ground in Springfield, his pistol fired 6,000 rounds without a single failure, and the argument was over. On March 29, 1911, the Army adopted it formally. Pistol, caliber .45, model 1911. The name was the year, and the year became a legend. If you have ever held one, you know the feeling the moment it settles into your hand. It is heavy in a way that feels honest. The steel is thick. The lines are flat and plain, and the men who carried it gave it a plain name to match. Old Slab Side. The GI 45. There was nothing delicate about it. You could drop it in sand, drop it in mud, drag it through a river, and it would still send a heavy slug exactly where you pointed it. It did not ask to be babied. It asked to be used. A soldier could learn its whole character in an afternoon and trust it for the rest of his life. There is a reason it earned that trust. The design was simple enough that a soldier could strip it down to its parts in the dark, clean it, and put it back together without a single tool, guided by feel alone. 7 rounds in the magazine, 1 in the pipe, and a slide that racked back with a heavy metallic authority you could feel in your wrist. It was not a target pistol. It was never meant to win competitions on a range. It was built for the worst moment of a man's life, the moment when everything else had gone wrong and there were only a few feet of space left between him and someone trying to kill him. In that moment, it did not fail. That was the whole promise, and for 3/4 of a century, it kept it. And that is exactly what happened, across more than half a century and every war America fought in it. In the trenches of the First World War, officers pulled it in close quarters where a rifle was too long to swing. In the Second World War, the country needed so many that Colt alone could not make them all. The government spread the contracts across the nation. A typewriter company made them. A railroad signal company made them. A sewing machine company, Singer, made a few hundred so beautifully that collectors now pay fortunes for one. By the end of that war, more than 2 million of these pistols had been built, and they were everywhere an American in uniform was. On the beaches, in the bombers, on the hips of the men who came home, then Korea, then Vietnam. The same gun, the same weight, the same flat, reliable bark. A generation of fathers carried it, and a generation of sons grew up knowing the shape of it in a drawer or a footlocker. This is the part that matters, and it is the part no spreadsheet ever counted. The Colt 45 was not just military hardware. It was the object through which millions of American men understood their own fathers. It was there when your father shipped out, and it was there when he came back, and it sat in the house for the rest of his life. A heavy, quiet piece of him that you were allowed to hold, carefully, on the day he decided you were old enough. For 74 years, this was the sidearm of the United States military. Not a version of it, not a variant. This exact design from this one American company on a river in Connecticut. 74 years is longer than most countries keep a flag design. It is longer than the careers of every officer who ever carried it. It felt permanent. It felt like it would last as long as the country did. It did not. One decision changed everything, and it did not come from a competitor or a market or a mistake on the factory floor. It came from the customer. The one customer Colt could never afford to lose. By the late 1970s, the Pentagon wanted to modernize. The military was carrying too many different types of sidearm, a tangle of calibers and models, and the generals wanted one standard pistol, chambered for the 9mm round that America's NATO allies already used. In 1978, Congress ordered the search to begin. The trials that followed were called the XM9 trials, and to this day, they carry a smell of something that was never quite clean. The first round of testing, run by the Air Force, picked an Italian pistol. The Army objected, said the tests were not rigorous enough, and ran its own. Those Army tests were kept quiet, and every pistol in them, by some accounts, failed. The program was canceled and then restarted. Accusations flew for years that the process had been rigged one way to protect the old 45, then rigged another way to justify replacing it. When investigators later looked into it, they found no proof of outright corruption. But they also found that the army had withheld information and that the early trials had been anything but transparent. What is certain is this: when the final competition came down to its last contenders, Colt was no longer among them. The American company had withdrawn its pistol from the running before the trials were finished. And so it was that on April 10, 1985, the United States Army announced that its new standard sidearm would be the Beretta. Here is who won. Beretta is an Italian company from a valley in the north of Italy called Gardone Val Trompia. And it is not just old, it is almost impossibly old. The Beretta family had been making gun barrels in that same valley since the 1500s, since before there was a Protestant Reformation, since before Europeans had drawn a map of North America. 15 generations of one family in one valley making guns. To compete for the American contract, Beretta had built a factory in Maryland and made its pistols on American soil. And when the numbers were tallied, the Beretta and one other finalist scored almost even on performance, and Beretta won on price. It bid lower. The gun that had served America for 74 years was retired not because it was beaten in the dirt, but because a 500-year-old Italian family undercut it on cost. That was the first blow. It was not the last. The .45 had never been Colt's only government product. The company also built the M16 rifle, the standard American service rifle, and that rifle was the real engine of Colt's business. But in 1988, Colt lost the M16 contract too. It lost it to a company that bid $57.50 less per rifle, and that company was Fabrique Nationale, the Belgian firm. The same Belgian firm that John Browning had helped build into a powerhouse 3/4 of a century earlier. The genius who gave Colt its greatest gun had also, without ever meaning to, armed the rival that would one day take Colt's rifle business away. The knife had come back, exactly as the man's own history promised it would. And while all of this was happening, while the contracts were slipping away one after another, the factory floor in Hartford was tearing itself apart. In January of 1986, nearly the entire floor of the Hartford plant walked off the job. They were members of the United Auto Workers, and they had gone 10 months without a contract, and they were done. They wanted fair wages and safe conditions, and an end to what they saw as an effort to break their union. What began that winter would become the longest strike in the history of Connecticut, and one of the longest in the history of the country. It lasted 4 years. 4 years. The company kept the plant running with replacement workers, and the strikers stood on the line through 4 Hartford winters, and a nationwide boycott of Colt products spread across the union movement. Before it ended, 27 of those striking workers had died of ordinary causes, of age and illness, without ever going back to the jobs they had walked out of. That is how long 4 years is when you are standing outside the gate of the place you gave your life to. Now, the company had its reasons, and honesty demands that we say them plainly. Colt was bleeding. Its government contracts were vanishing. The market was flooded with cheaper handguns. On a balance sheet, cutting costs and holding the line against the union looked like survival, like the responsible thing, like arithmetic. That is what the spreadsheet said. But the spreadsheet could not measure what it costs a city when the place that made it proud turns on the people who made the product. It could not measure the 27 funerals. When the strike finally ended in 1990, the workers had won, back pay and raises, and even a share of ownership in the company. But by then, the thing that had made Colt Colt, the bond between the name on the building and the hands inside it, had been cut, and it would never quite heal. And then came the part of the story that the country was not watching, because the country was still looking at the gun. Through the 2000s, ownership of Colt passed into the hands of a private investment group. The controlling firm was a private equity outfit called Science Capital Management, the kind of company that does not make anything, that buys and sells other companies for a living, that measures a factory not by what it builds, but by what can be extracted from it. And what followed, according to the people who studied it closely, was a slow and deliberate hollowing out. The company was split in two, then merged back together in a deal that loaded it with enormous debt. Reorganization after reorganization, and each time, cash was pulled out of the company and moved somewhere else. The men who owned Colt were not trying to build the next great American gun. They were trying to get as much money out of the name as they could before the whole thing collapsed. In 2013, the last major military rifle contract went, once again, to Fabrique Nationale. And 2 years after that, in 2015, the company that Samuel Colt had built, the company that armed America through every war of the 20th century, filed for bankruptcy. On paper, it owed more than $380 million. The gun that won 2 world wars belonged to a company that could no longer pay its bills. Colt did not die that day. It clawed its way out of bankruptcy the following year, leaner and smaller. But the company that emerged was no longer looking for an American owner, and in 2021, it found a foreign one. A Czech firm, Colt CZ Group, headquartered in Prague, bought Colt outright. The price for the whole thing, for the name, the factory, the history, the rampant Colt, all of it, was $220 million. To put that in perspective, the company had owed more than that in debt 6 years earlier. America's most famous gunmaker was sold for less than it had once owed. And now consider the company that beat it, back at the start of the fall. Beretta, the Italian family firm from the valley in the mountains. In all the years that Colt was split and merged and loaded with debt and hollowed out and finally sold to Prague, Beretta stayed exactly what it had always been, still owned by the Beretta family. Still in the same valley in northern Italy where they had been making guns for 5 centuries. Still private. It never went bankrupt. It never got sold to a private equity firm that saw it as an asset to be stripped. It has outlasted the Roman Empire's ruins, the unification of Italy, 2 world wars fought across its own country, and it is still, today, in the hands of the family whose name is on the barrel. The company that replaced the American icon turned out to be more durable, more rooted, more permanent than the icon itself. So think carefully about what actually happened here, because it is easy to blame the wrong thing. Colt did not lose its soul because an Italian pistol was better than the .45. It was not. Colt did not lose its soul because Americans stopped loving the gun. They never stopped. Colt lost its soul because the customer it had married itself to walked away, and then the men who owned the company decided there was more money in taking it apart than in keeping it whole. It was not beaten by Beretta. It was not beaten by the market. It was hollowed out from the inside, by people who never made a single thing. The design itself never died. That is the strange, stubborn grace note at the end of this story. The 1911 was too good to disappear, and its patents ran out long ago. So today, you can buy a version of that same pistol from a dozen American companies. Springfield makes one, Kimber makes one, Rock Island makes one. The gun John Browning built lives on, in millions of hands, exactly as reliable as it ever was. What died was not the design. What died was the company. The soul outlived the body. Before we close, if this story found you, know that there are more like it, more American companies whose names you grew up trusting and whose real stories were never told. Subscribe, and we will keep telling them. This spring, in the year 2026, the final page turned. Colt CZ Group listed its shares on the stock exchange in Amsterdam. The company that built the pistol that won 2 world wars, the gun that rode on the hip of every American soldier for 74 years, the gun your father carried, is now a line of stock traded on a European exchange, an ocean away from the river where it was born. Stand at the corner of the old Colt Armory in Hartford, Connecticut, on the bank of the Connecticut River, and look up. The Blue Onion Dome is still there, still crowned with its gold stars, still topped by the little rearing horse. Close your eyes. It is 1855, and the drop hammers are shaking the ground beneath your feet, and the air is thick with oil and coal smoke. And 150 guns a day are coming off the floor, made by the best hands in America, in the largest arms factory on Earth. And the whole country knows exactly where this dome stands and exactly what it means. Now open your eyes. The dome is quiet. The floor beneath it has been turned into apartments and offices. The guns are made elsewhere now, by a company owned in Prague, listed in Amsterdam. The horse still rears against the sky over Hartford. But the thing it once stood for, the promise that the finest gun in the world was made here, by us, for us, has gone somewhere the eye cannot follow. What remains is the name. What remains is the horse. What left was everything the horse once meant.